Hello everyone, and welcome to, I am quite certain, the long-awaited installment of the next chapter of Draco Sinister. Let's just get right into it. Chapter 8, Demons and Angels. Draco poked at the food on his plate somewhat dispiritedly. It wasn't that the food wasn't good. To Draco's immense astonishment, Snape, amongst his other achievements, seemed to be able to produce a mean blueberry scone. But his stomach was tied in such tight knots that every bite was like swallowing jagged chunks of metal. It didn't help, of course, that Snape, sitting across the table from him in the small blue-painted kitchen, was staring at him with a piercing glare that Draco found very disconcerting. He had always thought that laceration by means of the eyes was a rather trite expression, but at the moment, Snape's beetle-black gaze made him feel as if the potion's master could stare right through his forehead to the back of his skull. "So," said Snape, crumbling a bit of scone absently between his forefingers, "you came to me because you thought I could help you. Or is it because you knew I wouldn't tell Sirius Black that you were here?" "Well," said Draco around a mouthful of scone, "you won't, will you?" "Considering that I wouldn't piss on him if he were on fire, that's an accurate assessment, yes. What do you care if he knows you're here?" "They'll try to bring me home," said Draco, as if this was obvious. Snape looked absently towards the little window set in the east wall. "I don't mind not telling Sirius Black where you are, but it seems somehow immoral to keep the news of your whereabouts from your mother. Perhaps you should owl her and tell her why you don't feel you can go home." Draco rolled his eyes. "And say what? 'Lo, Mum, I can't come home because I think I'm going mad. Not just a little mad, but full homicidal impulses barking. And by the way, send pocket money. Love, Draco.'" "You're not going mad," said the potion's master simply. "Going mad would be a fairly simple issue to deal with. This is much more complicated. You are not an ordinary boy." "I know, thanks. My father told me," said Draco, looking away. His mind didn't seem to be able to wrap itself around the idea that his father was dead, even though Snape had given him the details and shown him a copy of that afternoon's issue Daily Prophet with a headline about Lucius's death. He wasn't sure what he felt. Not grieved exactly, but certainly somewhat dazed. He was not looking forward to what might happen when the feeling wore off. Snape was looking thoughtful. "I admit that I'm surprised that your father told you of the Dark Lord's original plans for you." "Why?" "Because your father was a liar. He lied to everyone, even when there was no benefit in it to himself. He lied because he loved it." Draco didn't quite know how to respond. However he might feel about his father, family pride precluded him from insulting him in the presence of strangers, or near strangers. He recalled having once told Harry that he hated Lucius, but that had been different because he'd been quite sure he was about to die at the time. And anyway, that had been Harry. Snape calling his father a liar was something else. Perhaps he ought to leap to his feet and hit the man in the eye to save the honor of his family, but he didn't much feel like it. So he contented himself with glaring furiously at his half-empty teacup and muttering, "Milk." "What was that?" "Milk," said Draco again. "For my tea. I need some." "Get it yourself," said Snape shortly. Draco got to his feet and padded over to the pantry. It looked like an ordinary cabinet from the outside, but upon opening it, he found that it was stocked with dozens of clear glass canisters, each one neatly labeled in Snape's cramped, articulate handwriting. Bat's blood, salamander's eyes, dried mudwinkle, lizard ears, and tapioca pudding. Draco shut the door hastily and went back to the table. Snape glared at him. "I thought you were getting milk." "I decided I didn't want any." "Well, I want some." Draco, who was feeling dizzy and didn't really want to get up again, glared at him and raised his left arm. The pantry door slammed open, and the glass canister of milk flew out. It spun towards Draco and smacked into his hand. He banged it down on the table and raised his eyes to see Snape glaring at him more than ever. "Do not show off," the potions master said coldly. Draco opened his eyes wide. "Why not?" Bang! Snape brought his hand down on the table with a force that made the silverware rattle. "You think you get all that power for free?" he snarled. "Nothing is free." Draco shrank back against his chair. He felt scolded. In a way he had never really felt scolded before, not even by Sirius. It broke through a little of the hazy fog surrounding his brain, and he blinked at Snape in astonishment. "Be quiet," said Snape briskly, and got to his feet, pushing his chair back. "Sit here and don't move. And if you use any magic at all while I'm gone, even to lift the tea strainer, I'll force feed you a potion that'll turn you into a gerbil." "First a ferret, now a gerbil," said Draco irritably. "Why does everyone look at me and think rodent?" "Do you really want an answer to the question?" "No. Where are you going?" Draco realized he sounded plaintive and didn't care. He didn't want to be left alone. He'd been alone most of the day, and it was enough, especially with his brain feeling as if it was about to shake itself into pieces like an old broom. "To my workroom," said Snape. "I need to get something." "Let me come with you." "You've barely touched your scone. I don't want you fainting all over the place. I have a lot of very fragile and valuable equipment in that room." Draco grabbed up the reins of his scone and shoved it into his mouth, barely bothering to chew. He said, making a broad and expansive gesture with his arms that indicated he was done eating. Snape looked at him, and Draco could have sworn he saw a brief flicker of amusement tug at the corner of his sour mouth. "All right, come along." The workroom turned out to be more of a laboratory. The ceilings were high and dimly lit, and everywhere there were cauldrons bubbling over low fires, tall glass beakers filled with substances that steamed and sizzled, labeled bags and packets filled with crushed herbs, beetle shells, shredded boomslang skin, and other substances Draco couldn't have named. He walked from one table to another while Snape busied himself at a desk in the corner of the room, staring at the vials, flasks, and clear filters full of multicolored liquids. "What does that one do?" asked Draco, gazing at a beaker full of a bubbling lime green liquid. "Gets rid of chest hair," said Snape. "Ugh. Do you sell this stuff?" "Sometimes," replied Snape. "You think anyone could live on a salary they pay us at Hogwarts? Most of us do outside consulting work. Now sit down on that stool over there and shut up for a minute." Draco obediently sat down on the stool, which was next to a long, low desk piled with various bits and pieces of discarded junk. Rolls of twine, small jars of newt's eyes past their expiration date, snapped quills, a piece of broken mirror. It had been rather a long time since he'd even looked at his own reflection. Draco thought, reaching down to pick up the bit of broken mirror. That in itself was cause for alarm concerning his mental state. He held the bit of broken glass up and looked at his own reflected image in a state bordering on dismay. I look horrible. His summer tan seemed to have disappeared, and his skin looked as white and semi-translucent as paper. He must have lost weight, too, because he could see the sharp blades of his clavicles sticking up above the loose collar of Charlie's too large shirt. The shadows under his eyes were bruised blue, and his hair... Draco suddenly yelled and dropped the mirror. Snape, who had been investigating the contents of a desk drawer, straightened up and hurried over to Draco, careful not to spill the contents of the flask he was holding. "What is it? What's going on?" he asked, looking alarmed, or at least as alarmed as he ever looked. "I've got a white hair," said Draco, grabbing a handful of silvery strands and glaring upwards at them. "I'm only 16 and I've got a white hair!" Snape's look of alarm quickly changed to a look of disgusted amusement. "With the hair you've got, I don't see how you can tell." "Of course I can tell. What's happening to me? Am I dying?" "Your vanity is impressive, Mr. Malfoy, but I think your coiffure is the least of your problems," said Snape with a cold smile. "Here, drink this." And he shoved the flask he had been holding into Draco's hand. He glanced down. The flask was full of a thick-looking black liquid that bubbled and steamed and smelled vaguely like wet bricks. He said, "What's this when it's at home?" The potions master just looked at him. In the flickering light of the many fires in the workroom, Snape's face looked like a mask of itself, outlined in red shadows. "Drink it," he said again. "It will help you." Draco bit his lip. "Would you drink it, if you were me?" "I have drunk it. I made it especially for my own personal use, many years ago." Draco lowered the flask and stared. "Why?" Snape sighed and leaned back against the wall, hunching his angular shoulders inside his black robes, his expression unreadable. Then he reached down and slowly pulled up his left sleeve. He held his arm out to Draco, palm up, so that Draco could clearly see the dark mark branded into his skin. "This is not the only souvenir I ever carried from my association with the Dark Lord," said Snape, looking down at his own arm. "When we were his, we were tied to him, body, blood, and brain. That's part of the reason nobody ever left his service. If he did not find you and kill you himself, madness was the usual and inevitable other result. But you left." "I left, and I very nearly went mad. I took refuge with Dumbledore, and he protected me from bodily injury at the Dark Lord's hands, but he could not save my mind. Everywhere I went, every day, every hour, I heard the Dark Lord's voice in my head, promising that if I returned to his service, all would be forgiven. His voice spoke in my ear every day and all night in my dreams." Draco stared at him, his mouth half open. "Did you believe him?" "Oh, yes. Somehow, deep in my soul, I knew his promises were false, so I made that," said Snape shortly, pointing at the flask Draco held. "I had no idea at first if it would help me or kill me, but I worked hard, and it was successful. The voices in my head stilled, and my will once again became my own. I can only hope it will do the same for you." Draco looked back down at the potion, which was still swirling and bubbling. "I added a wakefulness potion to the mixture," he heard Snape say, sounding very far away. "It will keep you from sleeping and dreaming, at least for a few days." Draco nodded. "Cheers," he muttered, and lifted the flask to his mouth. He tilted his head back and swallowed hard. Despite its smell of bricks, the potion really had very little taste. He felt it snake its way down the back of his throat and hit his nearly empty stomach, where it sizzled. A wave of heat struck him, nearly making him drop the flask, and then a burning energy swept over him like a fever. It hurt a little, but was also curiously warming, and he had been so cold the past few days. "Oh," he said quietly, and leaned forward slowly until his head was resting on his folded arms. He felt Snape reach forward and pluck the flask out of his limp fingers. He suddenly missed Sirius, who would have put a hand on his shoulder, or patted his back, or something. He heard Snape's voice, as if from very far away. "Are you all right, Mr. Malfoy?" He sat up and rubbed at his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Would you like to lie down?" "I'm not tired." "No, you wouldn't be. The wakefulness potion works immediately, but the rest takes at least an hour for the full effects to be felt." Draco didn't say anything, just sat with the heels of his hands pressed against his eyes. He could feel the potion spreading its heat outward from his stomach, winding through his veins, making his heart pound wildly. He took a deep, shuddering breath and heard Snape say, "You are fighting a battle, young Malfoy, even if you don't quite know it yet." It was nearly 11 o'clock at the Barrow, and Ron and Ginny were eating dinner late. As a consequence, there were only 3 of them at the table, Mr. Weasley having already departed for a meeting at the Ministry. "I don't understand," said Mrs. Weasley, as she rejoined Ron and Ginny, bearing a plate of kippers. "What exactly is the situation with the Malfoy boy? Sirius said he was missing." "He's missing," agreed Ron blandly, reaching for the mashed potatoes. "That's the situation." "I remember seeing him at Flourish and Blott's years ago with his father," mused Mrs. Weasley, half to herself. "He looked a pale, underfed little thing." "He's grown a lot since then," said Ginny, and reached for the milk. "Is he at all like Lucius?" asked Mrs. Weasley. "Not to speak ill of the dead, but—" "Yes, he's just like him," said Ron. At the same time, Ginny said, "No." Mrs. Weasley looked startled. Ron rolled his eyes. "You have to forgive Ginny," he said to his mother in a world-weary tone. "She fancies him." "Ron, be quiet," Ginny said, glaring at her brother. "Well, you do," he said. "You fancy the pants off him. Admit it." "Ron," said Mrs. Weasley in a quelling tone, "leave your sister alone." Ron turned to her, looking injured. "But, Mum, he's a Malfoy." "So what?" said Mrs. Weasley. "Don't be so medieval." Ron goggled at his mother like a stranded goldfish, while she reached serenely for the teapot. "You'll have to learn to get along with him, won't you?" she said to her son,
if he's going to be Harry's stepbrother.
Ron mumbled something that sounded like, "He's a twat in pretentious trousers, whatever Harry says."
Mrs. Weasley looked curious. Wouldn't you describe Draco as a friend of Harry's?
"No," said Ron.
From what Narcissa said, that's not the impression I got, said Mrs. Weasley, in a tone of voice that meant she was not to be argued with. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yes, I had something to tell you too. While your father and I were at the manor, Professor Lupin asked me the oddest question.
This abrupt change of topic made both Ron and Ginny blink in surprise. Ron recovered first.
What do you want to know? He wanted to know if we had any Hufflepuff ancestors, said Mrs. Weasley.
Two siblings exchanged glances.
What'd you say, Mum?
Ron asked. Mrs. Weasley turned a bit pink around the ears.
I didn't say anything. Luckily your father was talking to Narcissa, or he would have started going on and on about how the Weasley family weasel looks a lot like the Hufflepuff badger, and how the Burrow used to be a castle.
"And the wine cellar used to be a dungeon," said Ron in a bored tone, "and the rock quarry out back used to be a moat."
"Well, there are manticles on the wall down in the wine cellar," Ginny pointed out.
"Yeah," said Ron, his voice dripping sarcasm, "because Fred and George put them there so they could chain up Percy when he was supposed to be babysitting." Mrs. Weasley was horrified.
"Fred and George chained up Percy?"
Ron looked as if he was aware he had said something he shouldn't.
"Well, it was all in good fun, and they never used the leg irons."
He was saved further explanations as, with a soft pop, Mr. Weasley apparated into the kitchen.
"Arthur!"
Mrs. Weasley jumped up, startled by the sight of her husband. Ginny, too, looked at him curiously. She had never seen her father look so disheveled. His robes were creased and untidy, his red hair was standing up every which way, and his face was crumpled into lines of strain and dismay.
"Arthur?"
Mrs. Weasley said again, hurrying towards him.
"What's the matter? Is the meeting over?"
"Yes," said Mr. Weasley tonelessly. "They've chosen a new Minister for Magic." Ron swiveled around in his seat to stare at his father.
"Who is it?"
Mr. Weasley swallowed visibly.
"Well,"
he said slowly,
"me."
Upon returning to the library, Lupin and Harry were surprised to see Sirius sitting at one of the tables eating dinner and flipping idly through some sort of chart while consulting Slytherin's diary at the same time. He glanced up in mild surprise as the other two wandered in. "Sirius?" said Lupin curiously. "Why are you eating in the library instead of at the dining room table?" "Narcissa had to go to the ministry. There's an inquest of it to Lucius's death," he said by way of explanation. "I hate eating in there alone. It reminds me too much of my parents' house." "Understandable," said Lupin. "Didn't the ministry want to talk to you too, Sirius?" asked Harry. "I mean, weren't you in the cell where he—" "Exploded?" Sirius finished for him. "Yes, I'll be going to the ministry tomorrow." He flipped over a page, sighed irritably, and glared over at Lupin. "Are you sure this translation key you gave me is correct? I can't make any sense out of this spell." "You've got a translation key for the diary?" asked Harry curiously. Lupin nodded. "I managed to take the Parseltongue spell off the book, but the problem is that the most useful part of the book, where Slytherin listed all the spells he used, was doubly encoded. He was apparently very suspicious that someone might try to steal his spells." Harry, meanwhile, was staring cross-eyed at one of the pieces of parchment that had a spell in Mermesh copied onto it. "Enliven the fearsome sex weevil?"
can't be right. Lupin made a face, reached forward, and took the parchment out of Sirius's hand. It says, Falux Horia Fini, Imiago, Molie. It's Latin. Not a spell I know, but it means something about projecting images. Somewhere in here is a spell Slytherin claimed allowed him to find his source. That would be Rowena, wherever she was, and project himself there. The mental link you and Draco share looks very much like that. In either case, it's worth a try if you're up for it. Sirius raised his head.
I'll put a locator charm on you, and once we send you through to where Draco is, I'll follow right after you.
But we don't even know if the mental link is working, Harry interrupted. It's not like I know where he is.
Lupin reached into his pocket and took his wand out.
Give me your hand, Harry. Your right hand.
Harry held his hand out to Lupin, who turned it over, palm up, and laid the tip of his wand against the jagged scar that ran diagonally across Harry's palm. Harry shuddered, as if it pained him, and his eyes met Sirius's across the desk.
This scar connects you two, said Lupin, just as the scar on your forehead connects you to you-know-who.
Harry nodded.
I know. Hold still, Lupin said.
Draco wished he could sleep, but the wakefulness potion didn't allow it. He had been grateful at first for the alert and burning energy it gave him, but now he felt weary of it. Not that he wanted to sleep and dream, he certainly didn't want that, but he was bored. Snape had gone into his workroom to play with his potions, and Draco had been kicking aimlessly around the house. He discovered very little, except that Snape had peculiar musical tastes. Then the article in the Daily Prophet about his father's death bloomed unbidden into his mind. Determined to have another look at it, he trudged down the hall to the potions master's workroom and pushed the door open. The cauldrons were still bubbling merrily away, but Snape, seated at his desk, appeared to be asleep, his head down on his arms, a quill drooping from his fingers. Seeing the prophet folded up on the edge of the desk, Draco reached out for it and paused. A scroll of parchment lay about 5 inches from Snape's hand, and on it he saw his own name written in the potion master's hand. Moving quietly, Draco dragged the scroll a little towards him across the desk and turned it around to read what was written there. I gave the potion to young Mr. Malfoy, and it did not hurt him, so he is not as far gone as I might have feared. Still, I am not sure how long the potion will work on someone whose strange magics are being worked upon. It might be that the potion could become dulled or almost insignificant within a matter of months. I won't know until I observe him more. I wish that Dumbledore were here to advise me. Draco pushed the parchment away from him, turning away from the desk, a sick feeling in his stomach. He walked out of the room into the hall, turned blindly to the right, opened the door there, and found himself standing on the porch in bright moonlight. It stabbed at his eyes like knives, and he sat down rather suddenly, his back against the wall of the house, drawing his knees up to his chest. Light bothered him? When had that started happening? So the potion was just a stopgap, if that. But in time it may not work at all, he thought darkly. It was certainly working at the present, however. Draco could feel it. It was as if someone had dropped a heavy iron portcullis between him and the surge of demands that had been his constant companions. The waking dreams were gone, the cloudy vision, the feeling that his ears were always ringing. He hadn't realized how quiet the world was, how still and peaceful.
But gone, too, was the exhilaration, the knowledge that he could do things he knew he would never otherwise have been able to do, even as a Majid. Inside the dragon pen, he had known he had the power inside him to hold all those dragons back. But that power also seemed to draw on him, like fire drawing oxygen, leaving only ashes behind. I'm not strong, he thought bitterly. If there is anything in me, in my mind or my soul, that fights the sword and the black dreams it brings, it isn't my own strength. It's Harry's. Whatever little bit of Harry he had managed to hold on to, whatever the Polyjuice potion had left him, all Harry, the one he was supposed to kill, and would if he got the chance. Draco reached out and took hold of the sword, his thin fingers wrapping themselves around the smooth, familiar, slightly dented hilt. He drew it towards him and onto his lap, the green jewels in the hilt winking at him like knowing eyes. It was heavy in his hand. Turning the sword over, Draco saw the one emerald that was missing. He glanced up. It was dark, and the sky was a cold metallic black. He stood up quickly and, gripping the sword, went back into the house, heading for the closet where he had left his firebolt. Ginny looked disconsolately at her reflection in the hallway mirror. She thought her hair wanted cutting. It spilled over her ears and down her back in flaming loops and ringlets, and amid all that color, she thought her face looked too pale and small. Almost absently, she reached up and began to wind it into braids behind her head. She was worried, not just about Draco now, but also about her parents. Far from being pleased by Mr. Weasley's sudden promotion, Mrs. Weasley had been terrified and furious.
Look what happened to Fudge! She had raged at her husband. They're just looking for someone they can set up, someone expendable. Don't accept Arthur.
Mr. Weasley hadn't agreed, and the argument had gone on for hours. Eventually, her parents had gone to bed, deciding to apparate themselves to London to talk things over with Percy in the morning. After all, his ministry connections had proven valuable before. Ginny finished braiding her hair, sighed, and decided to go upstairs and talk to Ron, who was still awake. She was still irritated with him for being so obnoxious at dinner, but so what? She was bored, and he might want to play Exploding Snap with her. She was just crossing the living room on her way to the stairs when she heard the noise. Whap! Ginny stiffened at the sound and paused. It came again, sharper this time. Whap! More curious than apprehensive, Ginny crossed the room to the window, drew the curtain back, and yelled out loud in surprise. Draco Malfoy was standing just outside the half-open window, peering in. When she yelled, he jumped back and waved frantically at her to be quiet. Ginny clapped a hand over her mouth, staring. "Did you have to scream?" he hissed, his tone holding more than a modicum of vexation. "Did you have to scare me half to death?" Draco looked affronted. "I knocked." "Yeah, on the window," she hissed. "Why couldn't you come to the door like a regular person?" "I didn't want to see the rest of your family. I wanted to see you, and was waiting for you to be alone. Now, are you going to let me in or not?" Ginny looked at him uncertainly, but his words echoed in her ears. "I wanted to see you." She reached out and pulled the window all the way up, allowing him to climb inside. He crawled over the sill and landed on his feet, straightening up slowly. Ginny stared at him in surprise. For someone who usually looked so neat, he was surprisingly disheveled. His hair was messy, and there was dirt and mud on his knees of his trousers. A long rip was across the front of his dragon hide jacket, and to top it all off, he had a cut lip and a black eye that was already beginning to turn 5 shades of the rainbow. She goggled at him. "What happened to your face?" Draco reached up and gingerly touched the corner of his eye.
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
Try me, said Ginny. Draco grinned and looked as if he were about to make a snide remark when they both heard a step in the hallway and Ron's voice calling, "Ginny!" He heard me scream, she thought, turning to Draco, who reached out and seized her shoulder. There was a whirl of movement, and the next thing she knew, they had rolled under the overstuffed sofa, and she was lying on her back with Draco on top of her, his legs intertwined with hers, his hand covering her mouth. She could feel his heart banging against hers. Her gaze flicked up and fastened on his own. She saw anxiety as well as amusement in his eyes before he glanced away. The living room door opened and Ron came in. All she could see of her brother were his shoes, which crossed the room quickly to open the window. She could picture Ron looking at it, puzzled, wondering. "Hey!" he called again. "Ginny, where are you?" Draco's body tensed against hers as Ron turned away from the window and came to stand in the middle of the room. He was standing so close to the sofa under which they were lying that Ginny could see where one of his shoelaces had been broken and retied. Feeling suddenly guilty, she closed her eyes and turned her face into Draco's shoulder. She could smell the material of his jacket. It smelled unnervingly of Charlie, but under that, he smelled like soap and cold night air, and it made her a little dizzy. "Ginny?" Ron called again, sounding exasperated. "Look, I know you're around here. I heard you. Are you still hacked off at me about what I said at dinner?" A strand of Draco's silvery fine hair fell across her face, tickling her mouth and nose, making her want to sneeze. She tensed, and Draco pulled back from her ever so slightly, and she could see the corner of one gray eye now, and the smooth plane of his cheek. "Ginny!" Ron called again, then sighed. "All right, fine, be that way," he snapped, and she saw his shoes moving away as he crossed the room into the kitchen. She began to move out from under the sofa, but Draco's grip tightened on her arm, and she heard him whisper, "Wait." A moment later came the familiar sound of the kitchen door slamming. Ron had gone out into the garden. Ginny twisted her head to the side so that she could see Draco properly. He was looking down at her, his expression serious, but his gray eyes were dancing. "Now you can move," he said, not whispering, but speaking softly, "if you want to." All the little hairs on the back of her neck seemed to prickle, and she couldn't help but to shiver all over. Whether from the look on his face or simply from nerves, she wasn't sure. "Of course I want to move," she whispered back. "You're crushing me, and your stupid belt buckle is digging into my leg." Draco looked down at her with limpid, innocent eyes. "How do you know that's my belt buckle?" Rolling her eyes, she broke their eye contact and wriggled out from under him, and then out from under the sofa. She stood up, brushing lint off her jeans, and glared as Draco crawled out after her. Irritatingly, he managed to make even wriggling out from under an overstuffed sofa look both graceful and intentional. Although when he stood up, she was happy to see that quite a bit of lint had attached itself to his coat. Looking at him sidelong, she said, "Do you want to come up to my bedroom? We can talk there." "No," said Draco witheringly. "I want to stay here in the living room and wait for your 6 brothers to come home, find me with you, kill me, and make trendy yet tasteless beaded curtains out of my lower intestines." Ginny rolled her eyes again. "All my brothers, except Ron, aren't here anyway, and my parents are sleeping." "Well, I wish you would have told me that before. If I'd known it was just Ron, I'd have stuck up behind him and whapped him over the head with my broomstick, and then we could have talked freely." "You would not have—" Ginny began automatically, then shook her head. "Okay, it's you, so maybe you would have. But I don't want to think about it. Now be quiet and follow me." To her surprise, Draco was obedient and followed her silently up the stairs and down the hall to her bedroom. Once inside, she shut the door quickly behind them and flipped the lock. "Luminous," she whispered, and the dark room lit with a soft glow. She turned and looked at Draco, who was glancing around, looking vaguely dumbfounded. "So," she said to him quickly, before an awkward silence could descend, "are you going to tell me what happened to your face or not? You look horrible."
"You'll give me a big head talking like that."
"I'm serious. What happened?"
"Neville Longbottom," said Draco, enunciating very clearly, "hit me in the eye with his remember-all."
He rubbed at the aforementioned eye ruefully, then glanced over at her bed.
"Can I sit down?"
he asked, and proceeded to flop down on the flowered coverlet without waiting for her to answer. "Neville Longbottom," she said. "How on earth?"
"I got this idea in my head," said Draco, gesturing eloquently with one lazy hand, "that I should go around and sort of apologize to the people I've wronged. I'm not sure why exactly. Anyway, I made a list of the people, and it was really, really long. So I threw it away and made a shorter list of people I've really wronged who also happen to live not too far away. And Neville was first."
"So why did he hit you with Remember-All? What did you do to him?"
Draco looked injured. "Nothing! I got to his house, knocked on the door. Neville took one look at me and launched the Remember-All at my head. Hit me in the eye. I suppose I should just be happy he wasn't toting around a pair of hedge clippers, or he'd have taken my ears off and kept them as a trophy."
"Did you get a chance to apologize to him?"
"Nah, I just left."
"Do you know, I get the impression Neville feels better now, so it wasn't an entirely wasted afternoon. Now, Hagrid was next on my list," he added, looking pained, "and he's a lot bigger than Longbottom, but I'm faster. I figure I should have just enough time to run up, apologize to him, and make a clean getaway before he gets the chance to stomp me into the consistency of instant porridge mix." Ginny realized that she was struggling not to laugh.
"What's wrong? You look like you're getting a headache," said Draco.
"Is that why you came here?" she asked. "To apologize to me?" Now he looked slightly abashed.
"Well, no," he admitted. "Actually, I thought you could tell Harry something for me."
Ginny shook her head, her braids snapping back and forth. "No way. Tell him yourself."
"I can't,"
said Draco, a slight edge to his voice. "Why not?"
"I can't. You'll just have to trust me on that." "No." "What?"
"No," she said again, and went over to sit down next to him on the bed. He was still looking at her disbelievingly. "I don't trust you. Why should I? You've never given me any reason to."
"After what you did yesterday, Mr.
I'm going to run off by myself and not even tell anyone where I'm going."
"Yeah," he interrupted her with a faint smile. "You know, I'm just going by Draco now."
Ginny pressed her mouth into a thin line.
"Whatever.
Look, I'm not going to tell Harry anything for you. You should tell him yourself. I bet he'd be glad to see you."
"He won't be so glad if he does see me,"
said Draco, but seemed disinclined to elaborate.
"I guess you wouldn't be persuaded to tell Sirius anything for me either."
"Certainly not."
"Or Lupin?"
"I said no."
"This is proving to be an entirely unrewarding visit."
Ginny narrowed her eyes at him.
"Fuck you, Malfoy."
He actually looked contrite.
"Look, I didn't mean it that way. It's been a very strange past few days, and I'm not thinking all that straight right now. My father..."
He waved away her expression of sympathy.
"The whole love potion thing, fighting with Sirius, lots of nightmares, 2 confusing snog sessions. You know, it's just all very..."
he broke off. Ginny was staring at him with a very odd expression. What? 2 confusing snog sessions? Where did you find the time for 2? Draco actually flushed, the tops of his cheekbones turning dark red. Then he sighed and flopped backwards against the wall, looking at her guiltily. I kissed Fleur de Claw. Fleur? Look, there were special circumstances. I had to. Had to? Ginny stared at him in disbelief. Draco looked wounded. Why do you care what I do? I don't, said Ginny, and then, well, maybe I do. She sighed. You're just so fickle. Fickle? I am not fickle. Yes, you are. You're meant to be pining for Hermione, but you snog Fleur? You're fickle. I'm just a Malfoy. In the good old days, the head of the Malfoy household would have 9, 10 wives, maybe, and I assure you, he was most devoted to all of them. Is there anything you don't joke about? Draco looked amused. What makes you think I'm joking? He reached over then and gently touched one of her braids. Your ribbon's coming undone, he said, deftly retied it and sat back. Ginny stared at him. The gesture had been oddly, well, brotherly wasn't really the word, as none of her brothers would have noticed something amiss with her hair, but it had been affectionate. I just wish you'd be honest, she said. Draco's eyes darkened. I don't lie. She was about to respond when there was a sharp knock at the door. Ginny, came Ron's voice in a harsh whisper. I know you're in there. Ginny sprang from the bed and went to the door. Go away, Ron, she hissed back. No, said Ron stubbornly. I'm not going away. I'm giving you 1 minute and then I'm coming in there. Ginny looked wildly at Draco, then grabbed his arm and dragged him over to her closet. She yanked the door open, pushed him inside, and slammed the closet shut. Then she turned quickly, pointed her wand at her bedroom door, and said, Alohomora. The door flew open, and Ron half fell into the room. He recovered his footing quickly, straightened up, and glared at her. What's your problem, Gin? Didn't you hear me calling you? No, Ginny lied. I was sleeping. I heard you yelling. I had a bad dream. This piece of information had the opposite effect that Ginny had intended, as Ron immediately stepped farther into the room, looking concerned. Are you sure you're okay? Do you want me to sit with you? I'm fine, said Ginny irritably. I'm not 10 anymore, Ron. I know that, but you're really sensitive to dark magic, and we've been around it a lot lately. Don't tell me it hasn't upset you. Ginny sighed. Of all her brothers, Ron was her favorite. Fred and George made her laugh more, but Ron had a sweetness that was very restful to be around. And look, added Ron, toeing the ground a bit, I'm sorry about all that stuff I said about Malfoy at dinner. Ginny gaped at him. Ron, it's okay, No, he said, holding up a hand. Let me finish. I don't like Malfoy. I'm never going to like him. I still think he's a low-life, double-crossing sleazeball with all the charm of a weak old head of lettuce. But I'd really like him. I'll make an effort to find something worthwhile about him. And I won't downgrade him in front of Mum, okay? Ron, I appreciate the sentiment. However, now really isn't the time to discuss this. I think you should go. And with that, Ginny pushed her bewildered brother out into the hallway, shut the door behind him, and leaned against it. Her hope that maybe Draco hadn't heard this exchange with Ron was shattered as he stepped out of the closet and looked at her with doleful eyes. If you really like me, he said, with a mildly inquiring look. Oh, be quiet, said Ginny wearily, and to her surprise, he fell silent, hands in his pockets, looking at her from under his hair. I think you'd better go too, she heard herself say. Looking startled, Draco took his hands out of his pockets. Ginny, he said, and she saw a flash of sympathy in his silver-black eyes. Don't, she said. Just come here for a minute. He crossed the room to her and stood there, looking inquiring. She reached up, hardly thinking about what she was doing, and put her hand on his face. His skin was so cold it burned her palm. He didn't move as she raised her wand and touched the tip lightly to his skin. Asclepio, she said, and the bruising around the eye vanished. Draco looked unusually subdued. Thank you. I don't know what it is that's in you, Draco, she said, finally saying what she'd been wanting to say all evening. But there's something, and it's evil and dark. It's like poison in your blood. You have to get it out or I'll die. Yeah, I know. Go home, she said. Please don't try to do this by yourself. I can't. Please, she said. For me. He looked astonished, as if this request had shocked him. Then he reached out and took her by the upper arms. His hands were so cold, it was like having two frozen metal bracelets clasped around her skin. Ginny, he said. Suddenly, the tension between them altered in a way she couldn't name. She saw his half-startled expression as he lowered his mouth to hers. She felt his hair brush her cheek, and then... No! She pushed him away with such force that he actually made a little noise of surprise. He looked at her in astonishment. She felt as if she couldn't catch her breath, but tried to speak normally. Are you going to go home? He sighed. You know I'm not. Then you don't get to kiss me, she said, and crossed her arms over her chest. Draco just looked at her. Finally, he said in a tone that suggested the words were being pulled from deep inside him. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. He hunched his shoulders inside his jacket and looked at her regretfully. Then he crossed the room to the window where he leaned over the sill, reached out a hand, and she heard him call, I see a firebolt. A moment later, his broomstick was in his hand. Lifting it, he crawled out onto the sill, swung his legs over it, and without a further word to Ginny, disappeared into the darkness. Harry? Harry, said Narcissa, how are you feeling? Weird, he replied, turning to look at her, like someone switched a light on in the back of my head. It had taken hours and many attempts to get the spell right before Harry had suddenly clapped his hands to his temple and had gotten abruptly to his feet. He had been staring out the window ever since. By that time, Narcissa had returned from the ministry, and Sirius and Lupin had informed her of their plan. To say that she was concerned for Harry's well-being in light of this little experiment was putting it lightly. Of course, she wanted to know where her son was, as much as the rest of them, probably more so. But this seemed risky. As if sensing her thoughts, Harry turned to regard the older woman with an apologetic look. I don't know where he is, he said, but I can tell you he isn't feeling very well, and he's freezing cold. Narcissa felt a tightening in her stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one she had gotten used to over the years. I appreciate your honesty about his situation, Harry, she said, and Harry nodded silently. Meanwhile, Sirius and Lupin, who had been in whispered conference, turned to look at Harry, who said suddenly, Let's do this. Right now? Asked Lupin, laying down the papers he had been holding and looking at Harry over his glasses. Why not right now? Said Harry flatly. You said he was in danger. He's not going to be any less in danger in an hour or 2 hours. The three adults exchanged looks.
"All right," said Sirius, coming around the desk. "We work the second stage of the spell out. It shouldn't be too difficult to do. Remus," he added, glancing up at Lupin, who appeared to be lost in thought.
"Oh, yes," said Lupin, slowly gathering up some papers and went over to the window. When he took out his wand, Narcissa saw that his hand was shaking, but he still held it forward and put the tip of it to Harry's forehead. Harry looked up at him with steady green eyes. "All right," said Lupin. "Now, Padfoot, you be ready to..." "Imago Moliere," he began, paused, seemed to hesitate, and started again. "Imago Moliere." There was a clatter as the wand tumbled out of Lupin's hand, and he suddenly fell back. Harry looked up in alarm. "Professor, why did you..." "Remus?" Sirius interrupted and looked at his friend, the flicker of surprise on his face turning quickly to alarm. He set down the book he was holding and came to stand by Lupin, putting a hand on his arm. "Remus, are you..." Lupin raised his head and looked at Sirius. "The change," he said. "What? Now?" "It shouldn't be now. Not by my calculations. Not until tomorrow night. But I know what this is, Sirius." Lupin looked up, and Narcissa could see the lines of tension at the corners of his eyes and mouth. "Take me downstairs and lock me up," he said. Sirius hesitated. "We talked about this," said Lupin, with an edge to his voice. "The dungeons." "But it's too early!" "Sirius!" Arrested in mid-speech, Sirius shut his mouth and looked at Lupin with worried, dark eyes. Lupin looked back, frowning, and stood up. Sirius shrugged. "All right," he said. "All right. Narcissa, I'll be back in 10 minutes. But the complicated part of the spell is done already. All you have to do is say the words and send him through." The moment they were gone, Narcissa turned to look at Harry and saw that his eyes had an odd sort of light in them, and his jaw was set stubbornly. She hesitated for a moment, then, slowly, reached for the parchment that Sirius had left on the desk. Draco was standing at the edge of the old rock quarry behind the Weasleys' house, staring down at the black water 15 feet below him. He had seen moonlight glit off the water and had descended to take a look. From the air, it had seemed more like the moat that Mr. Weasley claimed it was. Up close, it was more closely resembling a long, cleft pit in the ground, falling away sharply and studded with uneven rocks. The bottom of the quarry was flooded with water, which gave back his own reflection, dim and cloudy, backlit by a full white moon. "Going swimming, Malfoy?" Draco spun around, nearly stumbled, but regained his balance and stared. He had always thought that people who claimed that they couldn't believe their eyes were overstating, but at this moment he actually could not believe that he was really seeing what he was seeing. Harry stood about 10 feet from him, near where Draco had left his firebolt, under the shade of a cluster of trees. As he stepped out of the shade, the moonlight traced the hollow under his eyes, the shape of his face, his set, stubborn expression. He had his hands in his pockets, but his posture wasn't casual, and he was glaring at Draco with a challenging expression in his eyes. "Potter," said Draco wearily. "No, I'm not going swimming. I don't know how to swim, for starters, and Charlie's clothes weigh about a ton. What are you doing here?" Harry didn't open his mouth, but Draco heard his voice echo inside his head. "What do you think I'm doing here?" Draco's jaw dropped. "How did you do that?" Harry looked pleased. "Neat trick, isn't it? Lupin reopened up that mental link we had from the Polyjuice potion. I suppose we could have done this all along if we'd bothered to try." Don't worry, he added, his mouth curling up at the corners. I can't read your mind any more than you can read mine.
I wasn't worried, Draco lied. Harry's mouth curled up even farther.
Yes, you were. Fear not. Your fantasies about Professor Flitwick in a leather bikini are completely safe with me.
Draco snorted. Professor Flitwick?
See? There you go. You can do it. It's a legit thing, you know.
Draco sighed. Yeah, I guess I can. But so what? He said out loud. Listen to me, Potter. This is not a good place for you to be right now. Go apparate yourself back home. Harry took a step back, still looking stubborn.
Fine,
But nothing, Draco shouted. And talk out loud, will you? You know, it's a mystery to me how you've managed to stay alive all these years, walking blithely into horrible danger every chance you get. I bet you think it's charming and amusing and heroic. Well, it isn't. You're just stupid. And if it wasn't for other people, you'd already be dead 100 times over. You know it's true, and that's what I can't believe. Because your life actually means something. Potter, you were put on this earth for a reason, and you just want to throw it all away. You make me sick. Harry's eyes sparked angrily. Me? Throwing my life away? That's rich coming from you. There's no point being jealous of me when... Who says I'm jealous of you? You are, said Harry calmly. And can we talk about something else, Malfoy? Like the fact that your hands are shaking, you're thinking about killing yourself. I wasn't going to do it, snapped Draco. Everybody thinks about... I don't, said Harry firmly. Not ever. Draco looked at Harry, who was looking at him with the same sort of steady, searching expression he sometimes got when looking for the snitch. He opened his mouth to say something, when he felt a sudden bolt of cold chewed up his left arm, and, glancing down, saw the sword twitch in his grasp. He didn't even remember grabbing it. He glanced back up at Harry, his heart beating more rapidly now. Get out of here, Potter. I'm warning you. You're making a big fuss about nothing, said Harry, taking a step towards him. Draco couldn't quite believe how obtuse Harry was being. He wanted to cut and run, but his legs felt as if they had been filled with lead, and there was a strange and terrible buzzing in his ears. The sword jerked again in his grasp, more insistently this time, like a dog wanting to be let off its leash. Draco glanced down at it, then back up at Harry, as a cold certainty spread like poison through his veins. It's the potion, he thought. Snape's potion, draining out of my blood. I'm losing it, losing my grip. But his grip on the sword, at least, remained steady. He had the sudden wild feeling that it had welded itself to his hand, and he couldn't have dropped it if he wanted to. Draco spoke rapidly, not looking at Harry. Look, I know I haven't given you many reasons to trust me, but you have to believe me. Don't come any closer. Malfoy, I'm begging you, Harry, and I don't beg. Please go away. He heard Harry laugh. Hey, you actually said my name. That's a first, isn't it? Draco jerked his head up, staring at Harry, now standing less than a foot away from him, in disbelief. How could anyone be so stupid? Would you just stop blithering and get the hell out of here? Draco yelled, but it was too late. He felt his left arm, which had been tense against his side, whip forward without any volition of his own, and the blade plunged squarely into the left side of Harry's chest. They were halfway along the underground corridor that led to the dungeons, when Sirius suddenly realized that he was walking alone. Turning in confusion, he raised his wand, shedding its light along the dark corridor. Remus? He called. I'm here, came a faint voice. Sirius raised his wand higher and saw Lupin standing very still in the middle of the corridor, bent forward slightly, his hands on his knees.
He went hastily to his friend and put a hand on his shoulder.
What's wrong?
I don't know, said Lupin in a wondering tone. He coughed and straightened up, looking at Sirius, who saw that his friend's usually steady gray eyes were lit with a mute sort of panic. Sirius felt a cold fist of fear unfurl itself in his stomach. Lupin was rarely afraid, certainly almost never panicked.
Are you in pain? He said. From the change?
This isn't the change, Sirius. This is something else. And with that, Lupin suddenly pitched forward, stumbling into Sirius and knocking the wand out of his hand. Sirius caught his friend around the shoulders as he fell and lowered himself slowly to the ground, where he knelt down next to him. Lupin's face was ashen, his breathing labored. His eyes searched Sirius's face, alert now with something more than panic.
Mooney, what's going on?
I don't know. Lupin tensed around a spasm of pain, eyes still wide. He sucked in a breath, raised his hands, and stared at them. Something's happening. Sirius looked too, knowing what he would see. Lupin's hands were always the first thing to change. They had already begun the process, the nails lengthening and becoming glassy, fingers buckling and curving. Sirius, I think I'm being cold. You have to get me into a cell.
Cold?
Sirius echoed blankly. The centaur, said Lupin breathlessly. He told me that Slytherin would call all the creatures he made. He warned me.
But you're not a dark creature.
I am, Sirius, said Lupin, and suddenly arched his back and yelled out loud, one that almost sounded like a howl. He suddenly reached out and seized the collar of Sirius's shirt, his sharpened nails raking through the material, nearly grazing Sirius's throat. Sirius reached out and caught at Lupin's hands.
Mooney,
take me to a cell, Sirius. Do it! Sirius put his arm around Lupin and lifted him to his feet.
All right, let's go.
Draco lay on the ground, his heart pounding in his ears like a locomotive engine. When he had lunged at Harry, the sword had gone into his chest and then through it. And then Draco suddenly found himself stumbling as his whole body fell through Harry, sword and all. It clattered to the ground in front of him, and he stared at it wildly.
Malfoy?
Draco spun around on his knees and stared. Harry stood in front of him, unwounded, unruffled, even. If anything, he looked faintly embarrassed. Then Draco realized he could see through Harry, see the outline of the trees behind him, see the faint pinpricks of the stars through his eyes. Draco's heart now felt as if it had disappeared entirely, and there was a huge empty space in his chest. He sucked in a gasping breath and heard himself whisper,
"You're transparent, Potter. If you're not dead, you'd better have a really good explanation as to why I can see right through you."
Harry ran a hand through his hair and smiled.
"I'm not really here," he said.
"There was a spell in Salazar Slytherin's book that explained how to do this, and Lupin thought it would be a good idea. It's almost like apparating, except that my body stays behind at the manor. You can see me here, and I can walk and talk, but I can't touch anything, and I don't have any substance, and I can't be killed." Draco got to his feet. His legs felt a little bit like wobbly spaghetti, but they held him.
"I can't believe Sirius would let you do this, even if you can't be hurt."
Harry looked slightly more embarrassed.
"Well, your mother is actually the one who let me do this. She's the one who helped get me here."
"Fantastic," said Draco bitterly.
"You know, I could kill myself right now, and there's not a damn thing you could do about it," he pointed out. "You're not even really here, remember, transparent boy? Could you not call me that? Sorry,
It's a bit distracting talking to you when I can see through your head. Did it ever occur to you that maybe Slytherin wants you to die? Said Harry abruptly. Draco looked at him. No, he wants me alive.
Young Master Malfoy is correct, said a voice from behind them.
Harry and Draco had been so absorbed in glaring at each other that neither of them had seen the black-robed figure approach. Draco spun around, his eyes widening as he saw the short, round man standing on the path leading to the quarry, his hood pulled down, the moonlight reflecting off his bald head, his glittering silver hand. Wormtail. The cell door clanged shut behind Sirius, clinking as it locked. His arm around Lupin's shoulders, he half carried, half dragged him over to the lone stone bench that ran along one wall and lowered him onto it. Lupin rolled over onto his back, looked up at Sirius and groaned. When I said take me to a cell and lock me in, I didn't mean you should lock yourself in with me. I've sat with you before through the change. I'll do it again. I can always transform if I have to. No. Lupin struggled to sit up, and Sirius was alarmed by how bad he looked. I told you, this is different, he said, reaching up to pluck off his glasses and press the heels of his palms to his eyes. There must be something I can do. You can get out of the cell, Sirius, said Lupin, who once again curled in on himself and groaned in pain.
He's right,
said a voice behind them, and Sirius jumped, his heart slamming against his ribcage like an inexpertly hit bludger. He spun around and saw a face pressed against the bars of the cell opposite. A gray, wrinkled face set with brilliant red eyes like coruscating jewels. The demon, he thought. Apparently, it had recovered from being knocked out by Harry and was looking as if it would like to reach a hand through the bars, but the wards Sirius had put up prevented it.
The werewolf is right,
said the demon again, grinning maniacally.
He's being called. Stay in that cell and he'll tear you apart trying to get out.
Shut up, Sirius snapped, and turned back to Lupin, who was back to lying flat on the bench, his hands over his face. The demon merely chortled.
Only an idiot would stay locked in a cell with a werewolf, it said. But only the heir to the throne of a kingdom of idiots would stay locked in a cell with a werewolf, being called by dark powers.
That does it, muttered Sirius, and fumbled in his pocket for his wand, then paused. His pocket was empty. He swore and glared at the demon, wanting nothing more than to leap across the space that separated them and bash its gloating face in. If you don't shut up, he told it in measured tones. Trying to bluff, I'll finish what Harry started. The demon bared its teeth at him and hissed.
You know nothing,
it snarled at him. I know you tried to kill my godson. The demon's eyes whirled, concentric circles of black and red.
I was not trying to kill him,
it began indignantly, and then its red eyes widened, and Sirius whirled around to see the wolf at his back. He's correct, Harry echoed, glaring at Wormtail. What do you mean, he's correct? And how did you find us? Wormtail gave a cold smile.
Us, he repeated. That rather presupposes that I was looking for both of you, doesn't it? And the sad fact, young Mr. Potter, is that I'm quite as surprised to see you as you are to see me. It was Draco I was looking for.
Harry glanced sideways at Draco, who had gone very pale, but didn't look surprised. How did you find me?
he asked in a tight voice.
My master watched you through that portkey he gave you. Then you very stupidly left it behind, and we lost you, briefly. Fortunately,
giggled Wormtail, and held up something in his metal hand that glittered like a tiny point of fire. The epicilical charm.
Your father was kind enough to offer this to my master in exchange for
being splattered all over his soul, snapped Draco, his voice shaking. Your master doesn't drive a very fair bargain, does he?
He is eminently fair to those who serve him fairly,
said Wormtail coolly. Draco took a step back. Harry experienced an odd urge to reach out and put a hand on the other boy's shoulder, but didn't, since he knew his hand would go right through Draco. It was very strange to be present and to feel real, and yet not to be able to affect his environment in any way. He wondered if this was what it was like to be a real ghost. Give me the charm, said Draco, looking steadily at Wormtail. Wormtail looked at him with equal measure, then got down on his knees on the grass, still looking at Draco as he did so. Draco glanced sideways at Harry, and Harry heard his voice in his head. What's he doing? Harry shrugged. I've no idea. Then Wormtail spoke, and his voice was his voice, but at the same time it wasn't.
Draco Malfoy,
he said, a faint buzzing undercutting his speech.
You are the heir of Slytherin. The time has come for you to ascend to your proper place, which is yours by right of blood and inheritance. The time has come for you to accept your patrimony.
Draco stared at Wormtail. No, he said succinctly. Wormtail glared, and suddenly a blazing circle of fire sprung up around them, encircling all three within its heated walls. Harry saw Draco wince and look away.
My master is prepared to offer you power beyond your wildest imaginings,
Wormtail said, his voice suddenly his own again. That's awfully vague, pointed out Draco. How come it's always power beyond your wildest imaginings, and never anything specific, like top box tickets to the Quidditch World Cup, and a year-long subscription to Play Wizard magazine? I mean, how about something I could use?
You could have power over weather,
Wormtail continued, glowering as he did so.
Power over the minds of other men, over dark creatures, and life and death. He offers you a chance to share the dark throne with him and sit as his left hand.
And all I have to do is what? Draco snapped. Give up my soul?
Oh, no,
said Wormtail.
You don't have to give up your soul. What would my master want with that? Souls are useful only to demons who have none of their own. No, my master wants your cooperation and your loyalty. That's all.
Draco turned to Harry, his arms crossed over his chest, and raised an eyebrow. I'm just not finding this guy believable, Potter, he said. Why do you think that is? Harry shrugged thoughtfully. Well, he lacks credibility. Draco turned back to Wormtail and smiled. It was the same smile that had spooked Charlie the night before, and Harry felt the back of his neck prickle, as if something cold had touched him. I'd have to say I agree with Potter, he said, his tone unpleasant. I suggest you leave, and don't forget to let the door hit you in the arse on the way out of town. Of course, with a target that size. Wormtail stiffened.
There's no reason to be insulting.
Draco snorted. I think there's every reason to be insulting. You kidnapped a friend of mine and told her that unless she drank an illegal love potion, you would kill her. You as good as killed Harry's parents, tried to kill him, And, oh yes, not that long ago you tried to kill me as well. Now you tell me that either I go with you to serve your master or else, well, you won't say what else, but knowing you, it's probably going to involve, big surprise here, killing. So far, you have done nothing to endear yourself to me, and much that has annoyed me profoundly. In fact, the way I look at it, you can just sleep on the couch from now on, because I don't think this relationship has a future. Wormtail's expression darkened.
Are you saying that you won't come willingly?
Draco smiled politely. I'm sorry, what part of sod off, you unspeakably fat git, didn't you understand? Wormtail looked as if he hadn't heard this. He was staring at Draco, and there was a look in his eyes that Harry didn't like at all.
You are the heir, he said to Draco. There is no other like you. As such, you are entitled to certain special treatment.
Draco looked both fascinated and repelled. What sort of special treatment?
3 times I must ask you,
Wormtail said, as if this were something he had learned by rote.
3 times I must ask you if you will come willingly before I can use force against you. For the last time, will you come with me to serve my master?
Draco looked at Harry, and then back at Wormtail and shook his head. No, I won't. Wormtail's mouth curled into an ugly smile.
Then I will have to force you.
Force me? Draco's face took on a tense, slightly maniacal look that Harry knew meant he was extremely angry. He held out his left hand, and the sword flew from the grass and landed in his grasp. Come anywhere near me, he said, swinging the blade forward directly at Wormtail's face, and I'll introduce you to the pointy end of Clarence.
Clarence?
Wormtail said, blinking. You named your sword? Harry asked, floored. So? Said Draco. You named it Clarence? Well, it was either that or give it a really overwrought name like Durandal or Grainswandir or Drainwin. And why are we talking about this right now? Wormtail was chuckling.
Ah, yes, he said, the living blade. Rather a large weapon for a youngster like yourself, don't you think, young Draco? Wouldn't you prefer a slingshot?
Harry glanced at Draco and saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes. He's just bluffing you, he thought. Stole him. Sirius should be here any minute. He's supposed to come through after me. Wormtail was still smiling as he slowly got to his feet, the fire dying about them as suddenly as it had sprung up.
You might as well know, he said, that there have been 3 living blades throughout history. Yours, that was once my master's. Godric Gryffindor had one, although his was not demonic in origin. And there was a 3rd. It no longer exists. It was melted down by the Dark Lord to make another weapon.
He raised his right hand, and Harry saw the moonlight gleam off the polished surface of his metal hand.
This weapon,
said Wormtail, and suddenly his hand shot forward, the fingers braiding themselves together, melting and reforming into a razor-edged blade, almost an exact image of the sword Draco held, although its hilt was Wormtail's wrist. Harry felt his eyes widen and shot a glance toward Draco, who looked equally astonished, but remained very still, his eyes fixed on Wormtail. If you wanted to kill me, said Draco tightly, you could just crush the charm. Wormtail shrugged, brandishing his elongated sword arm, which gleamed like a carapace of a metallic insect.
Slytherin wants you alive, but he never said anything about wanting you intact. You'll serve his purpose just as well missing your arms or your legs, or so I have been given to understand.
Draco didn't look afraid, just furious. Fine, he said. Come and get me then. Wormtail lunged towards him, just as Draco raised his sword, and the two blades hissed as they struck against each other. Harry saw Draco's eyes flick towards him quickly, saw him give a rueful smile before he turned back to the fight. God damn it, he raged inwardly. I feel like a complete useless bug. Sirius, where are you? And then, as he watched, he suddenly remembered the fencing room back at Malfoy Manor, its walls lined with terrifying weapons, and Lucius Malfoy tossing him a sword. Let's test your mettle, boy. Harry knew very little about sword fighting. It had never interested him particularly, but Quidditch had given him a good eye for skill, and it was clear that Lucius's training had surprising results. Draco could fight. He moved faster than Harry would have thought possible, and looked as if he was having a good time as well. Wormtail, quite obviously, couldn't fight, but it didn't seem to matter. His sword hand was doing all the work for him, leaping, cutting, thrusting, and lunging with an eye-dizzying swiftness. The fat little man followed along after the sword's direction like a hapless tin can tied to a car bumper. His eyes widened as the sword made a wide, sweeping swing towards Draco, who blocked, then nearly tripped as the blade cut at Draco's legs. Draco jumped over the blade and turned to face Wormtail, holding Slytherin's sword in front of him. You're pathetic, he hissed. You're tiring already. What are you going to do when you can no longer follow your own movements? Is your arm going to rip itself off and come after me? Wormtail's eyes widened as if this hadn't occurred to him. Let's find out, said Draco, and slashed at him, hard, with Slytherin's sword. Wormtail yelled and jumped back, bleeding from a cut on his shoulder. He made an attempt to back away, but the sword wouldn't let him. It leapt forward, cutting at Draco with renewed vigor. Draco ducked, but not quick enough to miss the blow entirely, and the tip of Wormtail's blade opened a wide gash along his cheekbone. Blood splattered down onto his white shirt. Are you all right? Harry thought at him quickly. Yes, Draco thought back, but it would be nice if Sirius made his appearance right about now. I can do it for a while, but not forever. Harry watched as Wormtail landed another blow, this time on Draco's arm, tearing the leather of his jacket. Bastard, Draco hissed under his breath, and swung his sword down hard. Wormtail rolled aside, missing the blow by inches. He was drenched in sweat now, his bald head glistening, his pudgy little eyes bulging with fear. He looked as if he would have liked to be anywhere else, but the living blade wouldn't let him go. Harry watched in amazement as Wormtail was wrenched to his feet and hurled again towards Draco, eyes screwed nearly shut in terror. Draco made a movement with his sword that seemed to Harry both incredibly tiny and incredibly quick, and Wormtail jerked back, bleeding from the wrist. They were standing nearly at the edge of the quarry now. Be careful, Harry thought at Draco. I'm always careful. Draco's thought broke off as Wormtail lunged at him again, arm outstretched. He struck at his blade, and the thrust went high and wide. Wormtail fell forward, the point of his blade jamming itself in a crack between two rocks. Harry saw him heave back with his shoulders, and it took a moment for him to realize that Wormtail's living blade was stuck fast, rendering him immobile. Draco turned, saw what had happened, and raised his sword. The bright blade glinted like moonlight seen in a mirror. Wormtail made a strangled sound of terror, gripping his right wrist with his left hand and pulling hard, but to no avail. Draco looked up at Harry, and his eyes held a question. Wordlessly,
Harry answered it, his gaze steady. Finish him.
You mean kill him?
Draco asked uneasily. Yes. Draco raised the sword again, and Wormtail screamed out loud. Harry saw Draco wince and step back a little, and Wormtail, seeing his movement, jerked hard on his caught arm. With a rending sound, it freed itself, and Wormtail stumbled backward, throwing out his hand.
Malfoy, watch out!
Harry thought sharply, but it was too late. The living blade caught Draco in the stomach. With a surprised "Ugh," he stumbled backward and lost his footing on the edge of the rock. Paralyzed with shock and horror, Harry saw Draco's eyes widen in surprise, his hands flying up, the sword tumbling out of his hand as he fell backwards and out of view. A moment later, Harry heard the splash as he struck the water, heard Draco's voice in his head.
I can't swim, for starters.
Harry was barely conscious of Wormtail, his face contorted with horror at what he had done, and disapparated. He was conscious only of the steady light in the back of his head, which was no longer steady, but had begun to flicker like a blown candle flame. He began to run and reached the edge of the quarry. Flinging himself down, he gazed at the still and unmoving black water.
This can't be happening.
There was no sign of anything, of any life, not even a ripple on the surface.
Malfoy!
He yelled, knowing it was useless, hearing only silence. He tipped his head back, despairingly, and looked up at the stars.
Sirius, where are you?
Back at Malfoy Manor, Narcissa suddenly saw Harry's hand tighten convulsively on the chair he was sitting in, his fingers gripping it so tightly it was agony.
Harry,
she whispered, leaning towards him. Harry. His muscles tensed abruptly, his back arcing up off the chair. Narcissa clapped a hand over her mouth.
Harry, what's going on?
She dropped down next to him, tried to take him by the shoulders, but he wrenched away from her, flailing out with his arms. She caught at one of his hands, clutching it tightly.
It's all right, Harry, she whispered. You're fine. Nothing can hurt you.
Harry tossed his head to the side and shouted, the first sound she had heard him make since he'd been put under the spell.
Sirius, where are you?
Narcissa looked around wildly.
Sirius, I have to get Sirius, she thought, but I don't want to leave Harry.
She got to her feet, letting go of his hand, her eyes still fixed on where he sat. He was still twitching, as if he were having a nightmare.
Nothing can hurt him. Lupin said nothing can hurt him.
She hesitated, then suddenly bolted towards the library door and flung it open with such a force that she heard the hinges creak. Then she tore out into the hallway, crying out for Sirius at the top of her lungs, even though she knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that it was already too late. Upstairs, Hermione was having a terrible dream. She was lost in the midst of some unknown place where she was searching for something that she had lost and couldn't seem to find. As she moved through the icy fog that surrounded her, a cold anchor in the pit of her stomach seemed to dog her at every step. It was a feeling that had been there every second of every minute since she had swallowed the potion Wormtail had given her. Then, suddenly, and without any reason, the feeling vanished. In her dream, Hermione clutched at her stomach, not daring to believe it. It's gone, she thought wildly, and just as quickly, another voice spoke in her mind, confusing her at first, but then knowledge began to spill itself into her conscience like a vase filling up with water. The spell's off me. With a shocked gasp, Hermione bolted awake. The release of the spell tearing through the draught of the living dead like flimsy tissue paper. her eyes taking in the room around her, feeling as lost and confused as if she had just woken from 100 years' sleep. Her heart was pounding wildly in her ears, and as she slid off the bed and attempted to walk the short distance to the door, one thought kept playing and replaying itself over and over in her mind. It's gone. The spell's off me. Where is Harry? Where is Draco? And that is all for this chapter, guys. Quotes. Yeah, I'm just going by Draco now. It's actually... Yeah, I'm just going by Buffy now. It's from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Durendal is from Chanson D. Roland's The Song of Roland. Greinswandier is from Nine Princes in Amber by Roger Zalansky. And Drangwyn is from the 13 Treasures of Britain. So again, if you are enjoying this kind of content, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. If you are interested in supporting me financially, I do have a Patreon, which has all of my artwork on it, as well as my personal stories. Or if you are not interested in that at all, I do have a Ko-fi. Both of these things are linked in my About section of my YouTube channel. I would like to thank my two supporters, Casey and 99. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. And that is all. I will see you all in the next one. Good night.